Thank you very much for this invitation to speak. I'm Serina Diniega. I'm a planetary scientist at JPL with a focus on understanding active processes on other planetary surfaces, including Mars. And Uma is my co-PI on this project.
So hi, everyone. My name is Uma Reba Pragada. I am a data scientist at JPL. I have a PhD in machine learning, and I have been working on data science systems or research projects around data science in astronomy, planetary science, and a little bit of earth science.
And I'll just point out on the line, I saw at least Mark had joined. So we've been working with a group of folks under the SUDS project. SUDS is Science Understanding with Data Science. This is a strategic area of research within JPL that is trying to bring data science into the physical science applications to not just, incrementally expand what's been done with manual studies, but to actually do amazing new science that is not possible when you're more limited with the manual approaches. For this overall project, our focus has been at looking at Martian frost, and I'll get into why that's so interesting and important in a bit. This presentation will focus mostly on our work with visible images, and then we'll talk a little bit, though, about how we're combining with that with thermal data. And then in the broader project, we're combining it with even more data sets. But this has been a great project to be engaged with. We've gone through 2 years of it and have a third year where we're starting to really pull together the results. I think today's presentation, we're going to do this one first, and then Uma can talk a little bit more about the SUDS initiative within JPL, and we're happy to answer questions on any of these areas. So Martian seasonal frost, the reason that we're really interested in understanding it is that the surface expression of that frost, it is visible on the surface, and it's visible through multiple different ways, not only with visible images, but also with thermal and spectral information. Seeing that frost on the surface, that is one of the best pieces of information we have on a global scale about the volatile cycles and transport that are happening every year on Mars and over the last couple of billion years, when the climate has been roughly similar of, being very dry, very driven by carbon dioxide and sublimation driven dynamics. So if we can better understanding the overall volatile cycle on Mars and what's happening through the different seasons, and then maybe how those variations are coming in between years as well. These are critical constraints for modeling the atmospheric dynamics of Mars, because of course those volatiles are generally moving through the atmosphere. Those volatiles on the surface, as they accumulate as frost and then sublime as it warms up, drive geomorphic activity such as avalanching. We see this happening, and this is one of the key drivers for landscape evolution through the Amazonian on Mars, like I said, the last couple billions of years. And then this is, of course, also critical information for mission planning. You want to be able to forecast the environment of surface exploration and operations. And then additionally, when it comes to thinking about human exploration, buried water ice reservoirs, reservoirs that are close to the surface and accessible, having that change in the subsurface will be reflected in the frost that's forming on the surface. So you can use this information to also get at subsurface structure and composition. And of course, buried water ice reservoirs are of great interest for human exploration, as well as, of course, a lot of climate questions. So that's where there's been a lot of studies that have looked at the seasonal frost on the surface and trying to understand its evolution through the winter season. And then many of these studies, though, have been either on a global scale, but using very coarse resolution thermal data, often thermal data. But that messes out on the patchier areas of frost. And then you've had more focused studies of specific regions that have used multiple data sets in the higher resolution data sets, but they've been just within a particular study site. A large part of the constraint on that is just time. The amount of scientist time it takes to go through these images and all of that is a huge amount. So here's all the different direct observations of frost that we can do with these particular instrument data sets. So we have the visible images with HiRISE and CTX, which are both on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. MCS's and Themis are the thermal datasets, Themis being on Odyssey and MCS also being on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and then CRISM, which is on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So all of these different datasets have been used in previous studies. We know how to find frost in them individually, but you can see the order of magnitude of the datasets. These are huge datasets that we're talking about. So I've worked on a lot of manual studies, especially with visible images, and those it's very hard to think about scoping that out globally. So bringing in the data science is what enables us to actually scale up and look at these massive data sets in a more consistent fashion across all of the different pieces of an individual data set. And then additionally, what we're trying to do with this project is combine the data. So not just look at visible images and use those to map out frost, but how do we combine that in an intelligent, strategic way with thermal data, which has a very different resolution, very different coverage amounts, and very different information that it's conveying about the state of the frost at the surface. How do we combine all of that together to give us a more complete picture of this natural system that is itself inherently complex, with information on many different scales, and then try to do that as for a global, more holistic picture. So that's basically what our project is. As mentioned, we're looking at all of these different data sets, and there are other data sets out there that we could be using. We're just initially focused on these ones. Part of the idea of this project is to develop the methodology for looking at each of these individual types of data, as well as how to combine them. And then it would theoretically become easier as you go forward if you might want, say, at a future time, add in another data set. A lot of the methodology and the nuances of how one works with each of the data sets and how you generate a format that is combinable, a lot of that would already be worked out. And so we're hoping in the future, if this were to be expanded, that it would be much easier to bring in, say, some of the ESA mission data sets as well. As mentioned, the primary ones we'll talk about today are the visible and the thermal data. One of our next steps is bringing in the CRISM. A lot of that's been worked out. We just haven't actually done the combination yet. So the way in which we've focused first on the bottom part, the visible data, that's where the machine learning has come in. So I'll go into the details of that, but basically we've trained a machine learning model to identify within these visible images whether or not frost is likely to be present, and associate also with that a uncertainty estimate. So it's not just a yes, no, there's actually an uncertainty associated with it. From the thermal data, so the nice thing when it comes to CO2 frost is if the surface temperature is at the CO2 frost point, then you just know that there is CO2 frost that forms on the surface. And so that's a much less ambiguous data set, but it's significantly coarser resolution. So for that one, what's been generated is kind of an interpolated surface thermal map using as much data as we have with MCS and Themis. And then that goes in and helps to correct some of the ambiguity that is present in the visible data set, right? Because if you have a bright surface, maybe it's frost, maybe it's dust, maybe it's just a bright rock. There's a lot of things that could appear to be frost on the surface. And certainly there are certain patterns that we know to look for and such, but there's just always going to be edge cases. The thermal data helps go in and correct for many of those. And the idea is then to combine these into this kind of global frost detection map. All right, so first talking about the visible images, which again is where the machine learning actually comes in. We're using HiRISE, which is a very high resolution data set. That's all of these pictures that are shown are from HiRISE, I believe. This is down to 25 centimeters per pixel, so you can see things that are about a meter across and resolve them pretty well. But HiRISE only covers about 3% of the Mars surface because it's such high resolution. CTX provides much better spatial coverage. We have a global data set for CTX. Of course, this is distributed through different seasons and different Mars years, but we have really good spatial coverage. But this is then more like 5 meters per pixel. So a couple orders of magnitude worse in resolution. Between these, though, they enable kind of meter scale patchy frost identification, which is not possible with the thermal data sets. But these are massive data sets. So again, I've worked with a lot of interns, and I've had a lot of students go through and manually, use their human eyeballs and brains to identify frost in these images. What we wanted to do was translate that into a machine learning framework so that we could go through a significantly larger number of HiRISE and CTX images. The other thing I'll just draw attention to here is you see these 3 different images. These all show frost. This is much of the difficulty, and one reason I've generally used human eyeballs and brains to do this sort of analysis is frost can look very different on different surfaces, and it depends on the time of year, depending on whether the surface is generally covered with frost, whether or not sublimation is started, as is present in that first image where you're getting these spots, or in fact, most of the surface is defrosted, like in the bottom right. So it can be very, this was a big part of our project, was coming up with a good training set, and then could also additional images that were used for validation and testing, to make sure that the machine learning model was picking up on the right cues. And in general, I think it was doing pretty good. All right, so we have an overall pipeline, and that's outlined at the top, and we'll step through. So we started out with our source images, and there's an example on the side. These are fairly large images because, again, they're very high resolution. It's 6 kilometers across is the actual spatial distance, and then the length of the image can vary. These were divided up into subframes, which then were small enough for us to be able to go in and do some labeling. And this was a manual step. So we did human labeling of a small number of representative images. We tried to get a diversity of locations, terrains, and kind of frost expression types in these. And then we went through and labeled the frost expression type, the terrain, so we could kind of check to see. We had a few coarse terrain types like craters or dunes, to make sure that it was operating well across these different terrains. And then of course the humans deciding whether or not there was frost present, and we assigned kind of a level, high, medium, or low confidence about frost identification. And that GIF there is kind of showing some of the different labels. One of the nice things here is that we use Label Box, and so it gave a really good platform for us to go in and label. We also generated a labeling guide, so we all had a kind of a common starting point of, this is what frost looks like, this is what you should be labeling. And then we had 3 experts label each subframe, and it made sure that at least 2 of them agreed. And we discussed, Label Box enabled us to be able to go and identify clearly some examples where we'd had disagreement. So for instance, here you can see disagreement between with the one not having labeled the interior of the crater, and we could go in and look at it and say, okay, why did you label it or not label something, and decide what we thought the actual answer was, and then also eliminate some of these cases where we were like, okay, this is just too ambiguous, maybe we don't want to use this in the training set. After we had labeled, we had those got further broken down into tiles, and then that is what then went into the validation, the training, validation, and test sets. And then it ran through the machine learning model. So in this case, we started, and Uma or Mark, correct me if I get anything wrong here. They're the data scientists who are on the line. We started with a machine learning model that had been pre-trained on a lot of Google images, on many different types of images that had nothing whatsoever to do with necessarily geology or Mars, but it was already pre-trained in terms of the types of kind of image characteristics that would be important for pattern identification and such. And then as we fed in our training set, it keyed on those specific aspects that we were trying to feed into it, of, for instance, having uniform albedo across the surface, or having sublimation spots and things like that. Then this model was run, and Mark has developed a pipeline, which I won't talk too much about here. But if anyone has questions on that, he's online and can answer them, about ways of optimizing at what step this machine learning model was stopped at. So evaluation of how well is it performing, and he developed a more automated way of doing that so that we could really come out with kind of the best model. And then there were additional validation steps that followed after that, that were more manual, of going in and making sure, okay, it's actually returning what we expect to be seeing, and fairly consistent with what a human would have labeled. One of the things I've had a lot of fun learning about with the data scientists is all the different ways that one does assess these models. So again, if anyone has questions about these exact plots, we have the data scientists on the line, but they introduced me to a lot of different ways of trying to understand how are we trading off false negatives versus false positives with regards to the level of certainty, and how the model, at what point the model is being trained to, and things like that, and different ways of evaluating it. And in general, though, we found ways that were improving the model, and so have pretty high confidence now in the results. So here you can see a HiRISE. In general, with the false negative, false positive, we're actually doing really, really well. And CTX, it's much harder, but that image set is harder to work with even manually. That lower resolution makes it much harder to identify some of the things that are much more high confidence diagnostics, like those sublimation spots and things like that. Those tend to be small. And so when you're at 5 meters per pixel, it sometimes is hard to tell. I think they're there, but it's hard to tell. So that higher level of ambiguity that's just present in that data set is reflected in our machine learning results. But again, very consistent with what a manual study would do. And this is another example of kind of the classifier improvements that had happened because we had some subpopulations identified. We could really look at, was the model performing just as well between defrosting, polygonal cracks, and uniform albedo? And then there was also some additional recalibration that occurred to help make sure that the confidence levels that were estimated were consistent with the output of the machine learning model. One thing that's going to be that we're working on and is a very important part of our project is we're writing up our science paper where we're finishing combining all of these data sets and really explaining this methodology, so to help get that information out to the physical scientist communities and really document very well kind of all of the data science techniques and such that we found to be very useful and that are really important for making sure that you have machine learning results that you can have high confidence with. Okay, I'm actually going to go ahead and pause there before I go into thermal measurements. Does anyone have any immediate questions about the visible stuff? I'm just checking the chat. Yeah, Mark commented there was something like I needed 60 to 7 interns if to do the full HiRISE analysis manually, and then CTX would have been significantly more than that. So as much as I've enjoyed working with the interns, it's been nice to be able to move to a machine learning framework. Are there any other immediate questions?
I was just curious because this is such a dynamic landform. When will you know that, okay, my training set has all dynamics of these frost landforms? How do you decide?
Yes, construction, that was something we learned in our first year of the project really well is, and then we kind of relearned aspects of that in the second year as we moved from HiRISE to CTX. Construction of the training set is an immensely important part of this. Your results are really only going to be as good as your training set is. And so that though then required a lot of cross collaboration and discussion between the physical scientist and the data scientist of saying, okay, here are some good examples, trying to span the range of what we would have been looking at in a manual study as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I'll add there, the type of expression of frost not only varies with terrain, but with time of year. So there are additional levels that one could put in where you could a priori try to explain to perhaps the model, images from these particular latitudes and these particular times of years, right? Frost would look more like this. And then, we intentionally, though, left any of that out. One thing is that that's another level of complexity, and you're potentially biasing your results significantly especially if you don't quite capture the full range of what's happening on Mars. So in this case, we just fed them all in, but then that increases your false positives and false negatives potentially, because it is now considering it's a human would have taken into account the time of year that the image was taken and the latitude and things like that. But there were certain aspects that we intentionally did not feed into the machine learning training.
Wow.
So, okay. Thank you for that question. Moving on to thermal measurements. So Gary Duran and our team has been doing a lot of work with this. As mentioned, what we're doing with the thermal, it's much coarser resolution, but it has a much less ambiguous indication of frost as long as you have large-scale frost coverage. So if the surface in general is at the CO2 frost temperature, then that indicates that you have a lot of frost on that surface, because that just physically, that's what happens. But what this doesn't capture is patchy frost. So if you have a surface that in general is close to the CO2 frost point, but not at it because it's not frosted, and you only have some small areas of frost, you're going to lose that because MCS is at that significantly coarser resolution. So in this case, what was done is here in the plots, you have the temperature was interpolated between the measurements that have been made between MRO. I think this one's just MRO, but Gary's been working on adding in the Odyssey Themis observations as well. You have an associated uncertainty with that interpolation. So at any given point in space and time, now you have a temperature, but the uncertainty is based on kind of how close you are to an actual measurement, as well as considerations of instrument measurement error and things like that. And then from that, we could turn that into a frost detection. So in all cases, what we're trying to do is take that data set and turn it into a frost detection, but specifically a frost probability. So that incorporates that uncertainty level. This is really helpful, though, for helping when you combine it with the visible data to identify false positives. So many frost-covered images, it's once the surface is entirely covered with frost, you actually don't have very clear indications necessarily that there's frost, other than the fact that everything looks the same. So again, a human brain, human eyeball looks at it and says, oh, I see lots of different terrains, like I see a dune and I see interdune area. Those normally would not be the same color, but because they are the same color, I know that the whole thing is covered with frost. That's a very good indicator, but you can have other things that uniformly cover a surface, such as if you have a lava flow field, it can be covered with dust, or even dunes and interdune areas could be covered with dust. And so just because you have that kind of more uniform albedo across the surface, that it looks like you have the same material covering it, it could be frost or dust. In this case, thermal is a key differentiator. You can't do it necessarily just with visible. So that's where the thermal really comes in, is it really helps us identify some of these visible false positives, where in this case, because what we're getting with the frost is a large scale frost covering, there's a very clear difference, though, in the likely surface temperature. So what we did with those, that's shown here, and these are somewhat old results. If any of you were at LPSC, I presented this there. We're working now on updating it with CTX and the updated thermal map, but the top is thermal only. So if you have white dots, it means that you have a very low frost confidence, and if you have blue dots, it's very high frost confidence. And this is plotted on a latitude versus solar longitude. Solar longitude is the time of Mars year, so what season you're in, versus latitude. So as expected, as you go closer to the poles, you should get more blue dots. And in the equatorial region, that rectangle in general, you're not expecting to find much frost there. So thermal, you have in the top, and then visibles on the bottom. And here you can see that there's a lot of blue dots through the equatorial region. Those are generally false positives. Those are probably lava flow fields that are very dust covered. And so everything has, again, that conformal, uniform composition layer across the top. And then additionally, but you see that the blue dots closer to the poles, and with that extension out away from the poles with the winter and then retreat in the spring, that's what those curves are, you get a lot more blue dots as you're moving up into those areas. So some of those are going to be false positives, but some of those are patchy areas of frost that are not captured by the thermal. And so it's once you start combining the two that you really get the value out of, now you are capturing some of that patchy frost as you move to lower latitude, more equatorial latitudes, but you're getting rid of a lot of those false positives. So we're still working on that, refining it, but that gives you an idea of the value of bringing these data sets together. And then here is a visualization that Gary put together. The blue background is more of that thermal surface temperature map. And then the squares that are appearing, those are individual HiRISE images. So we have way more that we can add in now with CTX, but individual HiRISE images where frost was detection. And you can see that you're getting some nice agreement. And in the areas where we have the HiRISE images, our final frost detection map will be at much higher resolution than areas where we only have the thermal data. And this, I think, hopefully illustrates what we're trying to get at with this is a very dynamic, multi-scale natural system. And what we're trying to do is to convey that information in a way that the physical scientist can gain intuition with the dynamics and the multi-scales, and not just zooming in on their particular area, because that's what they're limited to be able to look at. So our next steps, we have CTX frost detections, and then I have in red here the CRISM. I didn't talk about that one, but we have our CRISM frost detections. We're just now working up putting those into a map so we can take a look at it all. But developing a methodology for bringing those all together and then creating our integrated CO2 frost map is the big push over the next few months. And again, this methodology for how does one integrate these very different data sets in a way that respects the physical nature of the system and the limitations and benefits of each individual data set, as well as its resolution and coverage characteristics, finding a way of doing that in a very consistent, well-described manner, that a lot of that relies upon using a lot of kind of data science tools and techniques. And then we do have, we had a summer intern that looked at landforms. So this is kind of an indirect detection of frost. And so we're also looking at integrating that information, the geomorphology. There's certain landforms that are associated with certain types of frost, bringing that in as an indirect detection of frost to add in a little more resolution in areas where maybe we don't have any wintertime images, but we do have a summertime image of a landform. So we know that you had to have that sort of frost form during the winter. And I think that's all I have. So I'll pause for immediate questions, and then Uma can talk a bit about SUDS.